really appreciate you joining me this morning, and I hope you find some of the things I say interesting or perhaps a little challenging. What I plan to do this morning is give you a flavour of Business Story Manager, Business Story Method, sorry, what it is, where it came from, and how you can use this method to improve your software development. At the end of the slides, I'll have the opportunity to answer a few questions as well, so please feel free to enter some questions, and I'll try and cover off as many as I can. If I don't manage to get to your question, you're very welcome to drop me an email and I'll pick it up with you later. That's not a problem at all. Okay, so specifically what I want to cover this morning then, the topics I'm going to cover. And I come at this really from a business perspective. So I'm going to be looking at what the business drivers are behind using business stories as a technique. Whereabouts they fit in the overall software development life cycle, and what business stories actually are, what they look like. Now, when we talk about these in the industry, normally it's the structure of the stories that everybody actually concentrates on. And although that's important, I think that's a very small component of how to be successful with business stories. Really, I think it's how you implement the use of them within your own organization. So we're going to be having a bit of a look at Agile analysis, and I'll explain what I mean by that later on. We'll look at improved traceability and communications, and improved traceability back to requirements, and specifically goals and risks as well. We'll be looking at how business stories support acceptance and test-driven development, and how they overall try and bridge the communications gaps. And I'll give you at the end some options on how you can learn a little bit more as well. Okay then, so in terms of the drivers for business stories, when we're within an IT project, we tend to think about risks as being project risks, and we might look at we might look at risk-based testing, for example. But from a business perspective, IT itself is usually the biggest risk, even if it isn't the largest component of a program of work. It's always considered to be very high risk. Specifically from business people. And I think that kind of leads into a bit of mistrust between the business community and the IT community. So from a business community point of view, typically IT is viewed as somebody that, or an organization component that doesn't really deliver. We don't deliver the right thing, we don't deliver the right thing on time, and probably worst of all, we're very unpredictable. So in terms of management reporting, we'll say, yeah, everything's green, everything's going well, until right at the end, and then we say, oh, everything's red, and we've actually got a bit of a problem here. And that doesn't help build trust between the business community and the IT community. But from an IT community point of view, it's very easy for us to say, well, actually, if the business knew what they wanted, we'd be able to deliver the right thing on time. So it's not anyone's fault, but there's definitely a gap here. And when you look at the financial perspective as well, the cost of rework due to what I would call poor requirements, and by poor requirements I mean requirements that are inconsistent or incomplete, is exceedingly high. I mean, typically it's a minimum of 30% the cost of rework of a project in a traditional structured environment. And you might think that in the Agile world it's better. But it actually isn't. The average cost of rework in an Agile development environment is also at around 30%. And I was at a conference last week, actually, an Agile business conference put on by UNICOM, and one of the speakers there was saying how they track the cost of rework in some fairly major programs of work using an Agile approach, and they average 30%, and the case study he gave was actually quite a bit higher than that. So there's still a problem with the cost of rework. In terms of where business stories fit, they fit right in the middle, actually, of every aspect of software delivery. Now, you'll notice on this diagram that I haven't really even got development activities on here. I am coming at this from a business perspective. So stories do fit right in the middle. They fit between requirements and business processes, and they should feed back to the initiative, goals, and risks that are identified by the business stakeholders. In terms of the definition of what a business story is, this is our definition, but it's actually a fairly standard definition of a story. So on the previous diagram, you'll notice that stories were linked into requirements, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. But the components within this story itself, First of all, you've got the requirements, of course, which are the business goals, the business rules that support the business goals of a particular system. And then within the story itself, you've got the feature. A feature is really just an identification of an element of functionality. And we also call the feature a story header, so those terms can be kind of interchangeable. And then we've got scenarios, where examples of that feature behavior in use. And then we've got specific data that might drive different scenarios. And I'll talk about this a little bit more, but essentially that's the basic structure of a business story. If we look at the elements of that in a little bit more detail, we've got the anatomy of the business story header here. And anyone who's looked at using business stories is probably familiar with the keywords as a, I want, so that. But just in case you're not, as a refers to a role of a particular user who's going to be using a piece of functionality. The I want is a task that particular user wants to perform, and the so that is the goal of that particular user. So using this kind of story approach brings together all of those aspects so that we can kind of view the feature from different viewpoints and explore it in a little bit more detail. And also, you might find that just the use of roles isn't enough, particularly if you're deploying your solution into a diverse community. You might want to look at personas as well, which give a particular type of user, and use those within your stories too. I would recommend you have a look at that if you haven't done that already. And then on to the anatomy of the scenario itself. And again, the keywords given when then are probably going to be familiar to you if you've looked at stories before. But the other thing to note about this structure is that it's very similar to a test case. Any testers amongst you will recognize that given relates to the preconditions, when relates to the actions, and the then relates to the postconditions or outcomes. But it's actually in English language, so it's much easier for everyone on the project to understand. They don't think that it's specifically test case terminology. And also, the business scenario is constructed and defined before development actually starts, whereas the test case follows on from development. So there's an extra activity to take a scenario and create a test case, which is a little bit of test detailing, particularly in the given section or the preconditions section. Because once the software has been built, you know actually what it's going to look like. Okay. So stories may have many scenarios, and one of the questions I'm asked frequently on training courses and talking to people is, well, what's the right ratio? You know, how many story headers should we have for a requirement, and how many scenarios should we have for a particular feature? And there's no simple answer to that, but I do explore that in quite a lot of depth in the training course actually, because there is a ratio that makes sense. If you're getting too many scenarios for a particular feature, your feature's probably too broadly defined. So that's as a rule of thumb. And also, as I said before, scenarios can be data-driven. So if you find you're repeating the same kind of scenario over and over again, but with different values associated with it, then you can build a template scenario and actually a table of data that you're feeding through that template. And if you've come from a technical or a testing background, data-driven as a concept will be very familiar with you. But again, from an implementation point of view, I wouldn't recommend that you define story templates and data-driven approach until the people who are using business story method are actually very familiar with that approach, because it does tend to, particularly users, it does confuse them and turn them off a little bit. So with all this kind of value that you're getting out of business stories, why do you need anything else? Why do you actually need requirements? Surely business stories are enough, aren't they? One of the techniques that's very popular and very common at the moment is specification by example. It's the latest thing, it's very popular, it's very powerful, but I don't think that it's enough actually, and I'll explain why. If you were, as a business user, wanting to have calculator developed for you, just take a really simple example, and you only use the examples as it says here, you know, 3 times 3 equals 9, etc. The software that was delivered would provide you with a table of results, but it wouldn't provide you with the context of the business rules. So what about the decimals and negative numbers? We still need business rules for this example, and we still need business rules and requirements for other systems as well. So I tend to look at it as specification and example rather than specification by example, and I think then we've got something that's very powerful. Okay, so on to how business stories can actually improve software development. And the first of these things that I said I wanted to talk about was Agile analysis. Now, I hadn't heard the term Agile analysis until quite recently. It was coined to me by business analysts, strangely enough. But since that happened a few weeks ago, I'm seeing this term turn up all over the place. So it's quite interesting. I think it seems to be being adopted. Business analysts, in particular, are under quite a lot of pressure to go Agile. And they're not really sure what this might mean. Letting go of traditional requirements is actually quite painful for a lot of traditional business analysts. And actually, is it really necessary would be my question. And the other sort of hesitation that they've got, perhaps, in using business stories is it might feel like extra work. So from a business analyst point of view, they'd say, well, you mean you want us to write all these requirements and then you want us to write all these examples of them in use as well? Surely that's just going to take a lot longer and make our job a lot harder. But there is actually an appropriate solution that you can try for this, and that's the Agile analysis. That's where that comes in. So it's really more of applying Agile thinking, a state of mind to meet this challenge, rather than a sort of purist approach to applying Agile. And I think there are three key elements to Agile analysis. A high-level view of a business process, high-level view of key requirements, and by key requirements, I mean, there's always sort of 20% of requirements that give you 80% of the value, but it's really business value we're focused on here. So take the requirements that deliver the best business value and define them at a high level, and then use the stories to actually example those requirements in use. And what you can do then is what we call within the method a prototyping workshop approach. You can validate the output of that thinking, that analysis, with business stakeholders. And actually not just business stakeholders, technical stakeholders too. I think development should be involved within these workshops, for example. And I'll come on to that a little bit later on. But you're validating that output with key people, and to the point that you feel comfortable that you know enough to be able to start development. And that really delivers trusted requirements. So I think the kind of formal, structured approach of having requirements highly documented to a high level of detail and having them signed off might work for some organizations. But getting to the point where you know that you trust those requirements enough to start development, they're consistent enough, they're complete enough, okay, we know we've got at least this high-value component well enough understood, then we can start development. So this diagram just gives you that in a different form. The top right-hand corner is a fairly simple business process. I haven't got any words to explain what that is. It's actually an ATM. So you're using an ATM to put your card in, and it validates with your card's okay, and then you put your PIN number in, and then you go on to take money out. So it can be quite a complex business transaction, but actually that business process does give you a high-level view of it. And then you're looking at identifying key requirements and then verifying those requirements with business stories and iterating around that loop, if you like, those three activities until you either get to the point where you know you need more information, or you get to the point where you think, okay, we understand this well enough. So stakeholder workshops could be because you need more input, or it could be because you want to get to the point of having trusted requirements, essentially signed off requirements. Okay. So we talked about traceability, and this is a section of the diagram that I was showing earlier, really. And I can't stress enough the importance of being able to link business stories back to the requirements and back to the goals and the risks that the stakeholders identified at the beginning of the program of work. It's really important that you're able to link these things together, and this is where you start to think about, well, what level of technology support am I going to need to be able to achieve this? I think that just having yellow stickies on the whiteboard is great when you're a team of people in a single room, but as soon as you've got people that are remote from that team, you need to be able to deploy a method of collaborative working, so you need to have a look at that. And we explore that in the training courses as well. The other thing that's shown on this diagram is a dictionary, and I think this is really important as well for traceability, because one of the things that trips us up is terminology that's not used commonly or commonly understood. So having a dictionary of commonly used terms and business rules and even definitions of data items, I think is extremely powerful, particularly when you can trace the use of those business terms and data items throughout the requirements in the business stories. Then you're actually able to support impact analysis a lot more easily than you can do without it. Okay. Support for acceptance-driven testing is another thing that I wanted to explore in terms of the value of stories. And this is that business process diagram that we looked at a little bit earlier. And I've highlighted a path through that business process by using the red arrows and some darker blue colour, some infill colour to show a particular path. Now obviously you can have lots of paths through a business process, so I've just identified one. And if you spread that out, remove the little diamonds because those are questions of whether or not you go in one direction or another direction. Once you identified a path, you don't need those questions. So spread that out as a complete path through the business process. And now you've got yourself an end-to-end business transaction. And each one of these steps, of course, in the business path is a particular task, a particular element of functionality. And because the business stories relate to particular items of functionality or particular features, you can actually link an individual business story with a specific example, a specific scenario, and a specific set of data examples to each one of those steps within the business process. And so you've not just got then an end-to-end business transaction, but you've actually also got an end-to-end acceptance test. And as you can have multiple paths through the process, you can have multiple versions of stories associated with each of those features. So you can have one end-to-end test which is a positive test, and you can have others that are negative tests, and you can use different data examples for each one of these steps. So being able to link business stories back to those individual features and sets of functionality, I think is really powerful as well. So that's how business stories support acceptance testing. So before you even start development, you've actually essentially got your acceptance criteria defined. Now, in terms of supporting test-driven development, within the bubble here, you can see the elements of the Agile analysis that we've talked about already, and how that can actually create your acceptance tests. So your acceptance testers have a small amount of work to do in terms of the test detailing. Now that same information can be fed through to the developer, and as I said before, it's really important that regardless of your development approach, that your developers part of those workshops, prototyping workshops. Otherwise the tendency is for the analyst exercise to take the definition a little bit too far and end up setting some expectations in terms of the way the software will work that the developer can't deliver against, can't design for. So it's important the developer is part of that cycle of discussion and part of the workshop activity. But the developer is getting an awful lot more clarity about what's actually required out of this Agile analysis phase than they would have got with just the requirements. And in addition to that, each one of those business stories, because they are very similar to a test case, can be automatically linked to an automation engine. So what do you know? You've actually got automated tests to support test-driven development before development starts as well. So business stories being at the heart of everything is really, really powerful concept. Now, in terms of support for improved communications, remember what I said at the beginning about the communications gap between business and IT? And there are other gaps, of course, but I think that's quite a crucial one. Being able to relate what you're doing back to the business stakeholders is really important. So this diagram is showing how the goals and the risks that the stakeholders identify at the beginning of a program of work connect with each other to build a kind of network. We call it a goal network within BSM. That shows the relationships and the interdependencies of the goals and the risks that need to be taken account of. Now you can look at that goal network and subdivide that into chunks of work. And you might call them projects, you might call them iterations, you might call them sprints. It doesn't actually matter what you call them. It's work items, it's packages of work that need to be undertaken. And so for each one of those packages of work, you can implement Agile analysis, as we've talked about already, to get to the point where you know enough to be able to start development work. And then you take the next package of work and you do the Agile analysis again until you get to the point where you're ready to start development with that. Now, having that traceability of business stories right the way back to the goals does add a lot of value to improve communications, and everybody has a common understanding of what's expected from the software before the software starts to be written. How does that actually work in terms of supporting development? Because I said at the beginning of this that stories can support Agile development and structured development. So in the Agile world, you've got your Agile development on the right-hand side of this diagram with your backlog, which is the little red boxes with the yellow box on top. And Agile analysis can feed into Agile development. So you could look at this as a single sprint, if you like, with the business stakeholders and the product managers being involved in the Agile analysis and in the development phase. And then you could actually go through 2 sets of this before you pass any stories into the backlog for Agile development. One of the problems that I've observed is that being able to feed the backlog with enough well-defined stories to keep the development team working effectively and efficiently is really, really difficult. And if you don't get sufficient stories fed into the backlog, then you end up with the development team actually going off track a little bit, and because they want to keep busy, they'll carry on doing development work. So, okay, Agile analysis and structured development then. The Agile analysis is the same as we've talked about already, and the output from that can be fed into a formal structured design phase where you could actually go on to write a lot more detailed requirements in a traditional way, but you're also feeding the output from that Agile analysis directly into the acceptance testing as well. So it's just as powerful a technique for supporting structured development as it is Agile development. So what else do you need apart from business stories then? Well, we've covered a lot of this already, but just to summarize, we need to be able to link the stories and ultimately the tests as well back to requirements and goals and risks, because that way we can demonstrate the business value of delivered software. Everyone in the industry these days is talking about not delivering solutions, but delivering value. And by using business stories, as long as you've got these links in place, you are able to demonstrate the value of the delivered software. Capturing and storing business terms and data items, I think, is a really important part of this as well. You may have heard of the term ubiquitous language, which is another technique which is very popular at the moment. To be able to make use of that, you have to have a dictionary somewhere that will support that. You need to be able to capture business processes and paths through that business process, and then align specific business stories to those process path steps. And capture roles and personas as well, so you've got a common understanding of the definitions of those roles and personas that you're using throughout all of your stories. And it also helps to have some task management and some stakeholder reporting. Ultimately, you really do need some integrated support, technology support across the life cycle. We talk about this in the pocketbook a little bit more as well. So you'll be able to, and on the training course, so you'll be able to get your head around the kind of technology that you're going to need, perhaps to supplement what you've got already. Okay, so just to kind of summarize really what business story method actually really gives you, I think the common analysis approach, regardless of the development approach, is one of the most powerful things, because you've got analysts that can then work very happily to support Agile and structured development, which I think is a challenge at the moment. I think the improved communications between all the skill groups throughout the life cycle by the use of this common language, that's the structure of the business story, but also the common definition of business terms and data items. The improved reporting that you can give in the context of initiative goals and risks by having that traceability, if you like, between business stories back to requirements and goals. And one for me, having managed large IT departments before, having greater flexibility for resource management is incredibly powerful. When you've only got a small group of people who are specialists in working in an agile method, for example, scaling that is really, really hard. And being able to allocate people to projects, whether they're structured, a combination really of structured and agile projects, is quite a challenge. So I think it helps with that. Also helps to integrate and scale agile developments into other programs of work. And if you've got external suppliers, having a better definition of your requirements that you're giving to your suppliers is incredibly powerful. Helps you manage the suppliers, and it's also reduces their capability of making a lot of profit out of change control, which I think is a bit of a problem for our industry right now. And I think probably the biggest thing is the greater confidence in outcomes. You know, this communications gap of predictability that the IT department are considered to be very unpredictable and very high risk. I think getting greater confidence in the outcomes from IT and development is probably the greatest thing of all, actually. So ultimately, we're talking about an improved definition and assurance of software delivery, but hopefully at reduced cost as well by cutting out some of these miscommunications, being able to more tightly manage external suppliers. Then you are bringing your costs much more under control and are much more visible to you as well. So, okay, where do we go to learn more then? I mentioned the pocketbook as we were going through the presentation, and on the first slide you'll have seen a copy of that. Well, you can actually download that for free by visiting the Business Story Method website. You can also buy it for £10, and we'll brand the pocketbook with your company or team logo if you like. But visit the website and download one for free and take a look at some of the techniques in there. If you want to learn more, we've got a public course. The next one's on the 20th of November, so you can book yourself a place on the public course. And what I'll do on the public course is a lot of practice, because practicing these techniques is really important. That's how you learn, and only by practicing and repeating do you learn the right way and the wrong way. Or for you, you've got to be comfortable with using this technique. So we'll do a lot of practice, but we'll also focus a lot of attention on implementation of using stories as well, and covering all of the topics that I've summarized here. And we also have some discussions on, what kind of projects best suited to Agile and best suited to development using a structured approach. So we cover quite a lot of ground in that one-day course. However, it might be more suitable for your team to have a two-day in-house course, particularly if you're looking at piloting the use of the method on your own project. Then we can actually tailor the inputs to that course using your own requirements and build your stories for your project, and actually essentially give your pilot project a bit of a kickstart. So that's an option too. Okay, so that's the kind of 30-minute presentation section of this webinar just about over with now. And as I said, I'll have a look at some questions in a moment. But if I don't cover your question in this session, then please feel free to contact me, and I'll be very happy to kind of pick up with you any questions that you may have, or you may think of some things after the webinar, or your colleagues might listen to the repeat and they might have some questions. Always happy to be contacted, so don't hesitate, that will be absolutely fine. Okay, so I'm just going to have a look at the questions that have been asked now, and if you've got a question that you'd like to add, please add it in. All right. There's a question about logistics here in terms of sharing the slides or a recording following the presentation. Yeah, the webinar has actually been recorded, or is actually being recorded, and UNICOM will provide a link to that so that you can go and have a look at the slides and listen to the webinar again, so that's not a problem at all. There's another question here about expand discussion on using business story workshops across globally located teams. Well, this is where technology support comes in to play, really. In fact, one of the reasons that we came about building the business story method was to do exactly this, support a mixed estate. One of our customers was using part structured projects and part agile projects, but also located in multiple locations. And it actually doesn't matter whether your team is split across floors in the same building, different buildings in the same town or on the other side of the world. Once you've got distributed team, you've got a collaborative working issue. And so having common terminology of the stories and a common access to the goals and the requirements and the stories and ultimately the tests as well. So everybody seeing the same thing does allow for teams to be able to work globally. Also, if you've got a development team offshore and you've got your analysis team onshore, using the Agile analysis to get to the point where you've got trusted requirements in sufficient quantity to feed into the supplier's backlog, then that works really well as well. I hope that kind of covers that a little bit. Okay, there's another question here. Do you have any recommendations for software systems that support the business story process? Recommendations, it depends what you've got in place already. To be able to implement the method ourselves, then we've actually developed some supporting software for that. It's not something we spend a lot of time on the course on. I haven't really talked about it as part of this presentation, but there is some software that we provide on a software as a service basis. It costs about £1 a day per user, and actually that does support working in this life cycle. But there are other products out there that do different elements of this, so it really depends what you've got in your estate. But if you send me an email, I'll give you some information on the software that we've had to develop to support our method of working like this. Okay, there's another question here. In your experience as having requirements in the form of feature scenarios enough for the development team? I don't think it is, actually. I think that just having the feature scenarios doesn't give you the context of how those scenarios fit together. It doesn't give you the traceability back to the original business goals. It's very hard to achieve that unless you've got some high-level requirements or business rules in there as well. And what I've observed with Agile teams is they've gone away from initially using requirements and just started to use feature scenarios to drive the development team. And when they've got engagement from expert business users as part of the team, that can work very well, but that's not always the case. And so it's quite, what I'm finding now is that those same Agile development teams are going back to implementing the use of high-level requirements to be able to demonstrate that business value that I was talking about before. Okay. Just having a look at the questions here. I think I've got a few more minutes left if anyone has a question that I haven't addressed. Just checking through the questions. Okay. So does anyone have any more questions at all that they'd like me to address before we sign off from the webinar? Or does anyone think they've asked me a question I haven't actually covered? No? Well, I'll sign the webinar off now then, and say thanks again very much for coming along to the webinar, and I hope you found some of the things I said interesting. I hope you're able to follow up on some of the ideas that I've put forward in this. And I really appreciate your support this morning, and I hope you all have a nice day. Okay, look forward to hearing from you sometime. Okay, bye-bye.